Ukraine and Russia have resumed talks about the war, which had not taken place for many weeks. In particular, today Ukraine held consultations through intermediaries in Turkey and the United Arab Emirates on resuming the exchange of prisoners of war with Russia. The Secretary of Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, Rustem Umerov, reported this. According to him, new rounds of negotiations will take place in the near future, possibly even direct talks between Ukrainians and Russians. And here lies the danger. After all, even Rustem Umerov states that the parties have agreed, quote, to activate the Istanbul agreements. And what immediately comes to mind are those very Istanbul agreements that Vladimir Putin constantly insists on. Meanwhile, the topic of negotiations has become relevant again. For example, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban stated that the major powers should simply force Ukraine to make concessions, not Russia. Well, in Turkey, they have already stated that future negotiations to end the war will not take place somewhere else, but specifically in Turkey. At the same time, a close associate of Donald Trump, Finnish President Alexander Stubb, called the disruption of the Trump-Putin negotiations in Budapest a strategic mistake by the Russians. And he added that a ceasefire in Ukraine should not be expected until at least next spring. Let's talk about negotiations together if it's become interesting again. My name is Alexei Pichi. Let's discuss and analyze this topic together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, like this video, write any detailed comment under this video, and subscribe to my Telegram channel Pichi News. The link to it is in the description of this video. There we publish breaking news as it comes in. If you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so financially with any donation or a paid sponsorship subscription. Follow the links and details in the description of this video. It says there, support Alexei Pichi's channel. Use any convenient format. I appreciate any support you offer. So, the Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, Rustem Umerov, stated today that indirect negotiations with the Russians have resumed. They are taking place through intermediaries in Turkey and the United Arab Emirates. And now I'll quote Umerov, which caught my attention a little. As a result of the negotiations, the parties agreed to activate the Istanbul agreements. We're talking about the release of 1,200 Ukrainians. According to Umerov, technical consultations will take place in the near future, which should finalize all procedural and organizational details. There have been no comments from Russian authorities on this. And this is where a very dangerous confusion can arise. It's very important to understand the rhetoric here. When Rustem Umerov talks about the intensification of the Istanbul negotiations, the first thing that comes to mind is the talks in Istanbul in the spring of 2022, when the Kremlin tried to force Ukraine to capitulate and reduce the size of the Ukrainian armed forces. Neutral status, Russian language status, denazification, demilitarization, and so on. After the Istanbul deal was not concluded, Putin continued the full-scale war and constantly returns to it, demanding that Ukraine surrender territories, disarm, abandon its aspirations to join NATO, enshrine certain laws inspired by the Kremlin, and so on. And so when Umerov says today to activate the Istanbul agreements, well, the first thing I remember is precisely the negotiations in 2022. But in fact, it's not all that scary. The thing is, this year, already in this 2025, as Donald Trump rose to power, Ukrainian and Russian delegations resumed intensified negotiations in Istanbul. Well, you remember all those wild speeches by Medinsky this spring, right? So, Russia and Ukraine agreed to carry out a prisoner exchange based on the formula 1,200 for 1,200 back on July 23, following the third round of new negotiations in Istanbul. But unfortunately, this agreement still hasn't been fully implemented. On August 24, both sides exchanged 146 prisoners each, and on October 2, 185 each. In addition, Russia and Ukraine returned 20 civilians each. No information about preparations for new exchanges has been reported since then. Unfortunately, there was no 1,200 for 1,200 exchange. Although the Russians turned this story into a special bloody propaganda, claiming that the Kremlin allegedly handed over thousands, simply thousands, of living and dead Ukrainian defenders to Ukraine, and according to the Kremlin, Ukraine did not hand over the same number because supposedly there was no one to hand over. Remember I told you on this YouTube channel how? The Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera. refused to publish the interview with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, citing his statements as full of lies and manipulation. The newspaper said if we had to explain every statement by Lavrov, since they're all lies and manipulation, it would stop being a newspaper and become a massive magazine or encyclopedia. There's no point in publishing these lies at all? And then the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation got offended and declared that this was blatant censorship. Ultimately, they published the Lavrov interview on their website. So, in that interview, Lavrov cynically and falsely claimed that supposedly starting from 2025, the Russian side handed over more than 9,000 bodies of fallen Ukrainian armed forces soldiers to Ukraine. At the same time, according to him, Kiev returned only 143 bodies of Russian servicemen to Moscow. And then Lavrov manipulatively stated that supposedly losses on the battlefield are usually not discussed publicly, and suggested drawing your own conclusions from the numbers provided. He implied that Russia returned more than 9,000 bodies of fallen heroes to Ukraine, while Ukraine handed over only 143 bodies, suggesting that supposedly there were no more casualties in 2025. And now Ukraine and Russia have resumed negotiations about real exchanges, not the ones that are cynically announced. Let's return to this year's Istanbul negotiations. The Istanbul meetings did not bring any progress in ending the war. And on November 12th, the day before, Ukraine's Deputy Foreign Affairs head Serhiy Kyslytsya announced peace talks with Russia were suspended. He noted that it is impossible to have productive discussions with a delegation representing a dictator because they have a very strict mandate and must defend the position they were instructed to. At the same time, Ukraine was unable to get its international partners to increase pressure on President Vladimir Putin of Russia so that he would agree to a personal meeting with President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine. Let me remind you, the negotiations in Turkey took place in May, June, and July. Ukraine advocated for an unconditional ceasefire and an end to strikes on civilian infrastructure. The Russian delegation, led by the dictator's aide Vladimir Medinsky, did not agree to a truce and repeated Putin's maximalist demands, as he wants to gain full control of 5 occupied regions and reducing the size of Ukraine's armed forces. Following Kyslytsya's interview, the Russian Foreign Ministry stated that they are ready to resume bilateral talks in Turkey, emphasizing that the ball is in Ukraine's court. They added that Kiev has not responded to the proposal to form 3 working groups as part of the Istanbul process. That's right. Kyslytsya, mentioning this initiative, noted that the Russians proposed creating groups on WhatsApp, just 3 WhatsApp groups to correspond there, ignoring attempts to have a substantive conversation. They did this to convince the United States the negotiations worked and to show, see, we're chatting on WhatsApp, everything's fine. On November the 15th, Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan said the war in Ukraine is almost over. He noted that the darkest moment has come when both sides are focused on destroying each other's transportation and energy infrastructure. And then his quote, "The situation has reached a deadlock. No one can move anywhere. Nothing can happen." Well, according to him, European leaders, in particular those who visited Ankara, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, and German Chancellor Merz, hold a similar opinion. And today, Finnish President Alexander Stubb stated that the cancellation of the meeting between United States President Donald Trump and the Russian bald dictator Vladimir Putin in Budapest is a strategic mistake for Russia. This decision to cancel the meeting between Trump and Putin was made after a phone conversation between United States Secretary of State Marco Rubio and the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Stubb noted that during this conversation, Rubio realized that the Russians did not give in one bit. That means there's no point in putting President Trump in a situation where he won't get either an agreement or anything else. Quote, "Canceling the meeting was yet another example of a strategic mistake by the Russians. They had an opportunity and they missed it." In addition, Stubb also believes that the European Union is unlikely to open a direct channel of communication with Putin in the near future. Well, what next? He stated directly that a ceasefire in Ukraine is unlikely to be reached before spring. He also doesn't believe that real peace talks will begin this year. So that's why Stubb called on European leaders to consider increasing financial and military support for Ukraine. I'll end this episode with statements from Viktor Orban, Hungary's Prime Minister. He believes that the war in Ukraine can be ended very quickly. The European Union has enough leverage for this, and the European Union should be persuading Ukraine to make peace, not Russia. Viktor Orban stated that economic and political support from the European Union is critically important for Ukraine's existence. Therefore, if all support is simply taken away from Ukraine, Kiev will simply capitulate and the war will end. This is the solution Viktor Orban is offering us. And after that, Viktor Orban will deny that he's just an errand boy for the Kremlin. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.